I'm Mary, and I need to share something that shattered my life. Something I never imagined would touch my family. Something I can't keep quiet about anymore. 5 years ago, I married Richard. A good man, kind and hardworking, devoted to our family. We built a life together, and I thought we had it all. But there was something else in our story I never saw coming. Richard's son, David. David was 17 when I became his stepmother. He had already experienced more pain than anyone should. His mother passed away when he was just a boy, and Richard raised him alone. David was shaped by that loss, and I could see the grief still clung to him as he grew into a young man. I knew I could never replace his mother, and I didn't want to. I just wanted to be a kind, supportive presence for him, even if that meant giving him space. At first, I tried so hard to connect. I baked cookies, made his favorite dinners, helped him with his schoolwork. But David was distant, withdrawn, cold. It hurt, but I understood. He had his own grief to carry, and I respected it. I knew he wasn't ready to accept me. Maybe never would be. Richard worked long hours, often leaving David and me alone. The house felt empty without him, and it was just David and me, existing side by side, living in an uncomfortable silence. I tried to make the house feel like a home, cooking and cleaning, but it never felt complete. I felt like an outsider, and the guilt of not being able to break through to him gnawed at me. One evening, months after we had settled into our routine, everything changed. Richard was away, and David and I were alone once again. I had just set the table for dinner when David spoke, something I never expected. "You're very kind to me," he said, his voice low, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made my heart skip a beat. The words hung in the air, charged with emotion. I froze, unsure of what to say. "Of course, David. I care about you," I replied, trying to sound calm. But his gaze, it lingered. It was like he was searching for something in me, something I didn't know how to give. It unsettled me. The weeks that followed felt different. David started spending more time with me. He sat closer, offered to help with small chores, and sometimes made me tea when I was tired. At first, I convinced myself it was just kindness, maybe even politeness on his part. But the way he looked at me, almost desperate, unsettled me. I couldn't ignore the tension that was slowly building between us. Then one night, after a quiet dinner, David said something that sent a chill down my spine. He said he wished his mother could have met me. I reached out instinctively and took his hand, my heart racing. "She would have been proud of you, David," I whispered. But the way he looked at me then, his eyes dark and full of longing, made me pull my hand away. His touch lingered for a moment, his grip tightening as if he was afraid to let go. "I know it's wrong," he whispered, his voice trembling, "but I can't help how I feel." I couldn't breathe. My mind was spinning, my body frozen. What was he saying? I tried to explain, to pull back, but my own heart was pounding too loud to think clearly. "David, please," I whispered. "This isn't right. You're like a son to me. I love your father." He looked crushed, and for a moment I saw something darker flash in his eyes before he quickly looked away. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." But the damage was done. The weight of his confession hung between us like a storm cloud, and I couldn't stop thinking about it. I couldn't stop feeling that something had shifted, and I wasn't sure if I was strong enough to handle it. The days that followed were strained. David's presence in the house was suffocating. His gaze followed me everywhere, his actions now charged with an intensity I couldn't ignore. The distance I had worked so hard to maintain seemed to be disappearing. replaced by an unsettling closeness that made me uncomfortable. I couldn't tell myself it was nothing anymore. Something was wrong. One evening, as Richard was away again, David confessed again. He said he cared about me more than he should. His voice was shaking, raw with emotion. "I don't know how to stop feeling this way," he said. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body was frozen, terror and guilt flooding me. "David, stop," I pleaded, but he took a step closer, desperation in his eyes. This wasn't just a son seeking comfort. It was something more, something dangerous. I loved Richard. I wanted to protect my family, but how could I ignore the pull of this awful truth? I didn't know what to do. Should I tell Richard? Should I confront David? I knew that no matter what I did, the trust between Richard and me could never be the same again. And what if David needed more help than I realized? What if I was the only one who could help him, even if it meant destroying everything? I couldn't keep this secret any longer. That night, I told Richard the truth. His reaction was one I'll never forget. His face twisted with pain and disbelief. For a long time, he couldn't speak. When he did, it was only a whisper. "I can't believe this." David didn't come down for hours. Maybe he knew what was coming. Maybe he was afraid. But in that silence, I knew everything had changed. Our family was shattered, and I wasn't sure if it could ever be put back together again. The truth had torn us apart, and now all I could do was wonder if it could somehow heal us. But part of me feared it was already too late. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, the images flashed through my mind. David's face, eyes filled with longing, desperate for something I couldn't give him. His touch, cold and trembling against my skin, sending a chill that I could still feel in the marrow of my bones. I kept hearing his voice, the words he had whispered in that moment, replaying like a broken record in my head. I know it's wrong, but I can't help how I feel. I was numb. I was in a house that used to feel like home, but now it felt like a prison. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside, every sound was magnified, haunting me, reminding me of what had happened. I felt like I was being suffocated by a truth I couldn't escape. The weight of the decision I had made, telling Richard the truth, pressed heavily on my chest. I had hoped that confessing would release the tension, that it would give me the clarity I needed. But in the silence that followed, I felt more lost than ever. Richard had barely spoken after I told him. It was as if the words I had spoken were too much for him to process, too much for his heart to bear. He had asked me the same question 1,000 times. "Are you sure? Are you absolutely sure this is what happened?" His voice was so small, so broken, that it almost didn't sound like him anymore. I could only nod. I could only whisper, "I'm so sorry, Richard. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what was happening. I had tried so hard to be everything he needed. I had tried to be a good stepmother to David, but I had failed. I had allowed myself to be caught in a situation I never should have let develop. I wasn't proud of it. I was disgusted with myself." But I knew deep down that Richard needed the truth. He deserved to know what had happened between us, no matter how painful it was. The lies, the secrets, it couldn't go on. Not when everything I cared about was at risk. The next few days were a blur. Richard didn't say much to me. We avoided each other in the house, living in separate worlds. I stayed in the kitchen, staring blankly at the dishes that seemed to pile higher each day. I tried to keep my thoughts busy, but they kept slipping back to that night, to David. And David, where was he? He didn't come down for dinner that night, nor the night after. I had no idea where he was. I didn't want to look for him, but I knew I couldn't leave him alone forever. He was still my husband's son, still someone I was responsible for, despite everything. I had to make sure he was okay. I found him in his room, his door slightly ajar. When I knocked softly, he didn't answer. Hesitantly, I pushed it open, my heart racing in my chest. I wasn't prepared for what I saw. David was sitting on the edge of his bed, his head in his hands, his whole body shaking. He didn't look up when I entered. He didn't acknowledge my presence at all. "David," I whispered. "David, please, talk to me." He didn't move. His shoulders trembled as if he were trying to keep himself together, but I could see it. The deep anguish, the rawness, the devastation in the way his body was curled in on itself. He was breaking, just like Richard had, and I couldn't fix it. I wasn't strong enough. Finally, he looked up. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot. "You shouldn't have told him," he said, his voice low and filled with sorrow. "You should have kept it a secret. I didn't mean to hurt you." His words stung. "David, this isn't about keeping secrets," I said, my voice trembling despite myself. "You're not well. You need help. This is wrong, and I can't let it continue." But his gaze didn't falter. His eyes searched mine, searching for some sign, some crack in the armor I had built. "I don't know how to stop, Mary. It's like this feeling is inside me, and I can't get rid of it." The pain in his voice made me ache. My heart broke for him, but I couldn't let that cloud the truth. I couldn't let the love I once felt for him as a stepmother blind me to what needed to be done. "David, listen to me," I said, my voice firm but gentle. "You need help. You need to talk to someone who can help you through this. I can't do it, not alone. Your father can't either, but there are people who can, and we're going to help you, okay?" He shook his head violently, his fingers digging into his hair. "I don't want help," he muttered through clenched teeth. "I want you." I recoiled, the words cutting deeper than anything I had ever heard. My chest tightened, and I fought the urge to break down in front of him. "You don't want me, David," I said, my voice breaking. "You need someone to help you heal, but that's not me. I'm not the one you need. Please understand that." He stood up suddenly, his movements wild and unrestrained. "You don't understand," he shouted, his voice cracking. "I've lost everyone. I've lost my mother, and now you." He stopped, as if he were choking on the words. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. His anger, his pain, it was raw and real, but it wasn't something I could handle alone anymore. It was too much. It was beyond what I could give. "David, please," I whispered. "We can get through this, but you need to trust me. You have to trust me when I say this is not the way." He didn't respond. His face was a mask of confusion and hurt, and it shattered me. This wasn't the boy I had tried so hard to love. This wasn't the son Richard had raised. This was a stranger, a boy broken by grief and despair, reaching out in ways that couldn't be ignored. And just like that, I knew there was no turning back. Our family was fractured beyond repair, and the worst part was that I couldn't see a way to fix it. That night, Richard came to me. He didn't say much, just stood in the doorway of our bedroom, watching me with eyes full of quiet torment. I don't know what to do anymore, he said, his voice barely audible. How do we fix this, Mary? I didn't have an answer, and maybe that was the hardest part because I wasn't sure if anything could be fixed. I reached out to him, but it felt like a lifetime ago that we were the family we used to be. He walked in slowly, his hands trembling as he reached for mine. I'm sorry, I whispered. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Richard didn't speak for a long time, but when he did, his voice was thick with emotion. I don't know what to believe anymore, Mary. I don't know if I can look at him the same way, and I don't know if I can look at you the same way either. The room grew colder, the distance between us growing wider with every word. The truth had shattered us, and I wasn't sure if we could ever be whole again.